Good morning, everyone, and I just wanted to check in with a quick video to touch base on where we are in the digital media class. This week we had readings that we had to do online, so we're not meeting in person tonight, and the readings were about the early days of the personal computing industry, and primarily talking about the leadership of companies like Microsoft and Apple, and comparing with modern leadership with companies like Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg. So I read everybody's blog posts, and I just want to remind you to please engage more with the readings. This week the readings were light and contemporary. Hope you enjoyed the videos as well. But you need to be able to engage more, make connections, and make references to specific readings as we go. And please make sure to remember to comment on at least 2 other posts. So I'm going to go quickly through some of the highlights. I'm not going to cover it in great detail, but some of the highlights of the assigned readings for this week, and then we can maybe discuss those a little bit more next week and move on with the interactivity research that we will do next week. So we had some videos and we had a number of different readings to take a look at regarding Microsoft and Apple, and really kind of thinking about the roots of innovation and how people get inspired, and there's a little bit about passion and loving what you do. So first thing want to go to is this article about Johnny Ive, and I hope you had a chance to read it and take a look at it, because he's the designer that worked very closely with Steve Jobs and is probably responsible for most of the user interfaces that we engage with on a day-to-day basis. Really the design mind, the design brains behind Apple technology. And so he had a lot of really interesting things to discuss in this article about his background and his inspiration. And if you watched the Apple announcement or read any of the articles about the Apple announcement this week, he was very involved with the Apple Watch that was announced this week, and we'll see when that is actually available how successful it will be. But it's the kind of thing that Apple puts a lot of detail in. They put a lot of attention to the details so that the experience is as perfect as it can possibly be. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. Thinking about Apple and Steve Jobs' roots in starting the company and his journey of being kicked out of the company and then coming back. I mean, I think it's very inspiring to hear about somebody like him who was such an innovator. He was such a titan. He had a very interesting and different style. And I think, there's a lot of lore about him, especially now since he's passed away. And so it'll be very interesting to stay in touch with what's going on with Apple continually, because it's been almost 3 years since he's passed away, and consider the state of the company. They are still a successful company, obviously. They are still innovating and putting out new products, but I feel like some of the magic is gone. So I would like to get your input on that when we discuss this a little bit next week. I want to talk first about this article, how Apple got everything right by doing everything wrong. This is one of my favorite articles written by Wired magazine, because it's just counterintuitive why Apple is so successful as a Silicon Valley company. They didn't do the kinds of things that Google did, that Facebook is doing. They don't really coddle their employees. There's not a lot of the kinds of kumbaya, let's everybody be nice, the don't be evil phrase that belongs to Google. Apple is not very open with the press traditionally, and this article goes into a lot of detail about, despite all the conventional wisdom in Silicon Valley about how you should run a company, Apple has been successful by doing everything completely differently. My favorite part of this article is the very end of this article here. This is what Jeffrey Moore has said. He's an author. And he says everything that's happening is playing to his values, talking about Steve Jobs. He's at the absolute epicenter of the digitization of life. He's totally in the zone. And I was so inspired by that comment, because there just are people of a time that it is their time, and they don't need to do marketing research. Their intuition is what drives them, and we saw that person. And we have a different world now that Steve is not with us and running Apple, and we're not able to see the fruits of his innovation. So the next thing that I had here was, actually more about Steve. He was the CEO of the decade. It's actually interesting to look back on this timeline here and see the kinds of things that he did that have really changed our life. And this one here is an interesting article. I just like to throw it in there. It's from 2001. So, we have hindsight on our side. And it was somebody saying, sorry, Steve, here's why Apple stores won't work. Again, conventional wisdom was saying, no, this is not a good idea. You're going to fail at these computer stores. I think he said he'd give them 2 years and they would be closing up. I give them 2 years before they're turning out the lights on a very painful and expensive mistake. This was a quote that was from David Goldstein of the researcher company Channel Marketing Corp. And as we know in time that was not true, that the Apple stores are really the defining project that Apple created, because they knew that if people used their products, were able to touch them, feel them, try them out in an environment that was friendly, that they would be more successful, that people would be more likely to buy them. And they put the same care and detail into creating their retail experiences as they did in their products, and that's why they were very, very successful. And I also had you watch the Steve Jobs commencement address, and I just hope you're very inspired by that, because I always go back and look at that, and I just appreciate his passion, how he kind of connect the dots, and you can't really connect the dots going forward, you can just do it going backwards. And how he just talked about it's so important to love what you do, and it just makes, it has so much more meaning now that he is no longer with us. And I just threw in this article here about Steve Ballmer, who was the former CEO of Microsoft. And it just talks about maybe some of the places where he didn't make the right decisions for Microsoft. They were on top of their game, and he didn't go fast enough towards technologies like mobile technologies. They weren't successful in search, and they were never very social. So they missed out in a lot of areas. And describing here as the company suffered from the classic innovator's dilemma. And that is Clay Christensen's idea that legacy companies have a hard time adapting. So it'll be interesting to discuss throughout the semester what other companies will do and what kinds of problems they will have as they try to innovate into the future, and what kind of companies will unseat them. We used to all be on MySpace. We're not on MySpace anymore. That happened very quickly, where everybody moved to Facebook. Is Facebook going to be able to retain that, or will other companies come along and unseat them in terms of our hearts and minds and attention? And then I just had a couple blog posts that I wrote around the time that Steve Jobs resigned from the company as the CEO, and then after he passed away. And so I hope you just take a look at those and see. It was interesting for me to go back and read those and remembering how I felt at that particular time. But I also have this presentation that I gave a week later in class after I had a little bit of time to consider. And these are the things that I said that I learned from Steve Jobs. I learned that design matters, attention to detail. It's more than what it looks like. It's more than the outside aesthetic. It's how the product makes you feel. And I think you probably get that if you read some of my blog posts. Sometimes you have to be tough to get the best work out of people, and coddling them doesn't really help them or prepare them for the world. And setting high standards and staying committed to them is very important. I feel like I have to be this way with students sometimes, and I want them to understand that I want them to do their best and to reach their potential, and that I'm not just being mean. And Steve was sometimes thought of as mean, but he certainly got results. Consumer research, as far as Apple is concerned, they said, forget it. People can't tell you what they want if they haven't seen it before. To be truly visionary, you can't necessarily ask people what they want. You can get their input and you can get their ideas, but they really can't give you the next best thing, the next big thing that they're going to want. And Steve always said, make things that surprise and delight people. And he also was a believer that the most innovative, influential inventions are those that are the most surprising and unexpected. So sometimes you have to deal with criticism or skepticism because people aren't really ready for those things. Sometimes you're ahead of your game. Sometimes your ideas are. Don't be discouraged if they aren't immediately accepted. That's one thing I really had to learn. That's normal for anything that is a game changer. And then, of course, he said, live your best life. I think it's very important to find something that you're passionate about, that you love what you do. He says, don't settle. So I totally agree with that, and have had experiences in my life that have led me to a path where I'm very happy and I love what I do, and it has made a complete difference. I learned from him also to make things, make lots of things. Don't wait for someone to assign you to make things. Just go ahead and make things in your spare time, make things for fun. Push the envelope, try to learn new things all the time. And in his case, if you make things that make people feel better about themselves, things that inspire confidence, creativity, and joy, then you're doing something important. And as he knew, your failures define you as much as your successes. He was kicked out of the company he started, but then he was able to return with a lot of resilience. It's how you respond to those failures and what you learn that matters. And Apple was also big on this idea of the marriage of technology and liberal arts. It's not about either one separately. It's the way we integrate them that touches our souls. And I really like that sentiment. And you don't have to be a great technologist, designer, engineer, communicator, business person to be a visionary and to have a profound effect. Steve was really none of those things, and he was sort of all of those things. You have to understand culture and human nature. Being any of those things is great, but sometimes you have to see the intersections, the whole, and there's definitely value for people like that. So those are just the things that I shared with students. So that's it. There were a few other articles that talked about Apple, that talked about 25 years of Apple products. And then I also had the Pew report that was the 25-year retrospective on the web. And it had some very interesting demographic information about who uses the internet, who uses cell phones and smartphones in 2014. So I hope you had a chance to take a look at that. Those Pew reports are very important. There's a wealth of knowledge for any type of research you might want to do on any digital topic. So for next week, we have a few different things to do. We'll talk about your clout score, and hopefully you all join LinkedIn. Also, you're on Twitter, so I've started following all of you. What I want you to do now is find 3 additional professionals to follow, and they should be actual people as opposed to organization accounts. And I want you to send them a question. You would start the tweet with a @username, whatever their username is, and then ask them a question about their career or advice that they have for you. So for example, maybe @username, maybe you'd send it to somebody at a news organization that does news applications. What advice do you have for students who want to use data and storytelling? And then let's see what kind of responses we get. It's always a very interesting project, and we get some interesting responses. Sometimes people don't reply. Sometimes students have gotten internships and jobs because of connections they've made through this project. For the Facebook news, I really was fascinated by many of them. Obviously, the ones about the Apple products. I am probably going to get an iPhone 6, probably not a 6 Plus because I don't need a giant phone. Going to wait to see what those watches look like. And also, Nick had this article about Google Classroom. So I'm going to be checking that out. We're going to do a Hangout next week. Possibly I can do it within Google Classroom. So we'll see. I'll check that out. I will give you all the instructions you need to do that. In the meantime, if you'll send me your Gmail, send it to me in my email. Send me your Gmail, and I can get you set up for that. The main thing that you'll need is to just be in a quiet place, wear headphones, and be somewhere that has a pretty strong internet connection. And I'll send an email with all of that to you. The readings next week are on interactivity. There's some of the early readings where people tried to define interactivity, so it's more academic research. I want to get you used to the different kinds of academic research that people will do. And Jacqueline will prepare the main points from that research, and then we'll discuss those over the Hangout. One other thing, remember to comment on at least 2 of this week's posts so that you will be able to interact a little bit with what each other has said. So you have till tonight to do those. And then there is a question on the blog page that relates to interactivity, and that's what your blog post will be about next week. Basically, what is your definition of interactivity based on the readings that you do for next week? And so if anybody has any questions, feel free to email me or send me a tweet, and I will see you on the Hangout next week.